Welcome to episode 17 of Black Hat Theology. This is Dr. Peter Dillard. Over the last several lectures, we've been discussing how the Gelassenheit theologian, this theologian who is developing her view under the influence of the idea of Gelassenheit that we can find in the later writings of Martin Heidegger, how might this theologian explain the way in which the holy, as a kind of real presence that nevertheless is not any particular object or being, how might that holy presence enter into human decision making? How might it help us to make decisions in our lives under its guidance? Now, what I want to do in the lecture today is review the various components or elements that the Gelassenheit theologian brings together in her explanation of that kind of integration between the holy and human agency. I then want to give another example that I think is very interesting because it will help us point to the way in which this understanding of the holy can be made consonant or compatible, in fact, is deeply fitting with central Christian doctrines and teachings, in particular the Incarnation, this sort of Christological teaching that's at the very heart of Christianity. So those are the things I want to do in the lecture today. Now let's begin by reviewing. There are several aspects that the Gelassenheit theologian brings into the picture in order to give this explanation of how the holy can guide human decision making. The first one, remember, is this notion of thoughtful openness, which is a situation of relative clarity in which we find ourselves, at least for the time being, free from any kind of metaphysical or philosophical or perhaps some other kind of confusion, conceptual confusion, that might interfere with our thinking about the holy. The next component of this that the Gelassenheit theologian brings in is the notion of a trackle clock. A trackle clock is a relatively stable thing that we can consult from time to time in order to become aware of changes that either have transpired in our lives since the last time we consulted the trackle clock, or possible changes that might transpire between now and the next time we consulted, or at some point in the future. So the trackle clock is what focuses our awareness of actual and possible changes so that we can hold them up for decision. And what enables us to hold them up for decision leads us to the next aspect of that the Gelassenheit theologian wants to bring into the picture, and that's the notion of Hölderlin spatiality, where this spatiality is a kind of reflective distance in which we step back from the various spheres or spaces of activity where we pursue our ordinary everyday projects, where we're engrossed in whatever it is, whether it's taking children to school, or maybe it's milking the cow, or maybe it's delivering the mail, or whatever it is. We step back into this more reflective space where we're really not tied to any one of those things. And so then within this space, we can turn our attention to these changes of which we've become aware and hold them up for decision. What enables us to make that decision under the influence of the holy? Well, according to the Gelassenheit theology that I've been developing in these lectures, it has to do with the two major elements of the overall Gelassenheit experience. Remember, Gelassenheit is energized tranquility. So there's the aspect of energy and there's the aspect of tranquility. Now, depending on how these elements come together or don't, will determine whether we accept a particular change or reject a particular change of which we become aware, or maybe we ignore the change altogether. So if we have either the energy, when we think about the change in question, if we have the energy without the tranquility, that's a kind of agitation, a restlessness, an unpleasantness that would lead us to reject the change. Or correlatively, alternatively, if we have the tranquility without the energy, then that's a kind of peaceful, blasé, rather complacent feeling that makes us skeptical of the change because it's too easy. And so we would also set it aside, that we reject it there. If we felt none of those things, if we just had the sort of the same feelings that we've been having all along before we started thinking about the change, that would suggest that the change is really, we should be indifferent towards it. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really call for a decision. But when everything comes together, when we have both the energy of Gelassenheit with the tranquility of Gelassenheit, which leads to this very powerful and yet energized feeling of serenity, that is the sign that under the influence of the holy, we should accept the change. We should embrace it. So that in general is the kind of analysis of the relationship between the holy and human agency that the Gelassenheit theologian seeks to give, at least under the version of Gelassenheit theology that I'm developing. Now, what I want to do today is give another example where these elements come together from real life. And the example that I have in mind is described by a Quaker named Barry Morley. I believe that he's passed away. But he wrote a wonderful pamphlet many years ago about this notion of the sense of the meeting that one has in Quaker meetings, especially in the unprogrammed Friends tradition, this notion of sense of the meeting. Now, I was for many years, for approximately 5 years, some time ago, I was a member of a Quaker meeting, and I was a Quaker, and so I have some firsthand experience with the kind of things that Morley is talking about. I'm no longer a Quaker now, I'm a Roman Catholic, but even though I'm no longer a Quaker, I have a great deal of respect for the spirituality, the kind of spirituality that is practiced in Quaker meetings, and for the kind of example that Morley gives that I'm about to describe. So here was the situation. It occurred in Sandy Springs Friends meeting, which I believe is located somewhere in Maryland near Baltimore, but I'm not sure. But in any case, there was an old meeting house where the Quakers of Sandy Spring would come together and they would worship, every first day, that is every Sunday, as we would say in our tradition. So they would come there and worship, and they would also have various other events in the meeting house. Now what happened is that more and more people started coming to events at the meeting house, and there wasn't enough room inside for them to handle all the people who were coming. So what they decided they wanted to do, at least in general, was build a balcony over the first floor of the meeting house, a balcony in the back, so that they could accommodate the additional people who were coming to the meeting house. The problem was that from a long time ago, in the earlier days of the meeting, there was the remains of a partition in the upper half of the meeting house. So in other words, if you were looking up towards the ceiling and looking in the back, sort of the upper back part of the meeting, right down the middle, there was this partition. And it used to go all the way down to the floor, so that it used to be that it bisected the entire meeting into two rooms. And the women would go into one room, and the men would go into the other. So it was, at least in terms of gender, male and female, it was segregated. And that's how many Quakers used to worship back in the 18th and 19th centuries. So eventually the partition, most of it had been taken down, but there still was this little bit left up near the top. And so now the meeting got into a real problem. They had a real problem because they didn't know what to do. The meeting was divided. And so there were some people within the meeting who said, well, look, we need to get rid of this partition and replace it with the balcony, because the partition is a sign of the segregated past in the meaning between men and women, at least the inequality between the sexes. Yes, they were treated equally, but they were not allowed to commingle, and this is an artifact of an earlier time that we don't wish to memorialize. But then there were other people in the meeting who had the opposite feeling and were saying, well, it is part of our history, though, and we don't really want to take it down because that is what happened, and we should be mindful of things that have happened in the meeting, even if they may not have been completely copacetic in terms of how we think now. So what happened was they were thinking about this. They didn't know what to do, and they sort of wrangled on and on about it for a long time. They prayerfully considered it. They would meet together. Usually what happens in a Quaker meeting is that there's the first day service, that's the worship service, and then once a month after that there's a meeting for business. And so this is also an extension of the prayerful time that occurs during the first day service, but it's when the business and the various matters of the meeting are prayerfully considered and held up, as the Quakers would say, held up to the light for decision. So for 3 years, the members of the Sandy Springs meeting deliberated and wrangled about how to resolve this issue with the balcony and what to do about the remains of the partition for 3 years. And then one Sunday morning, there was a member of the meeting who was sitting on the facing bench, which is that's at the very front of the meeting house, and it looks back over the rows of pews that are in the rest of the meeting house. So sometimes people sit on the facing bench so that they can face the rest of the congregation. And so there was a member who was sitting on the facing bench, and he looked up suddenly and very thoughtfully and said, "I see a balcony that is going to be fronted or sided with, on the front side, the parts of the partition." In other words, they're going to take the panels from the partition and use that to panel the front of the balcony. So they're going to have the balcony, but they're going to have it with these panels taken from the old partition. And there was silence. There was something very powerful there because a way forward had been found. And at the very next business meeting, with very little deliberation, very little discussion, the members of the meeting as a whole approved that proposal, and they did go on to build this balcony with panels from the partition along the front of it. Now, let's look at this in terms of the glass and height theology we've been developing, because here we encounter all of the elements that I mentioned earlier. First of all, over time, in praying and reflecting and meditating, I think it's fairly safe to assume that the members of the meeting were in a space of thoughtful openness. They were at least trying to make sure that they weren't allowing their own prejudices or confusions or whatever to blind them. Maybe that took a little while, but they eventually were in this situation of thoughtful openness, which was very quiet and set the stage for a careful consideration about what to do concerning the balcony issue. Then there's the notion of a trochel clock. Now, what is that here? Well, it seems to me that the meeting house itself serves for the Quaker congregation as a trochel clock, because this is a place that they revisit on a regular basis. It's a kind of existential clock, whereby the individuals in the meeting and the meeting as a whole becomes aware of things that have changed in the past since the last time they visited the meeting house, or maybe it was the immediate last time, or maybe it was several years ago. Doesn't really matter. Or they might become aware of possible changes that could transpire in the future. So the meeting house here is functioning as a trochel clock that focuses their awareness on changes, actual or possible, in their lives. It's a kind of existential clock. Heraldry and spatiality also is involved here. And to document this, let me read something that Morley says about that. He talks at one point in his discussion of sense of the meeting, which is this Quaker term for, it's the Quaker term for reaching a kind of consensus or an agreement that's not simply a matter of taking votes, but it's a deep kind of unity in the meeting of the kind that we're discussing here in connection with the balcony issue. So he talks about what he calls the long focus as the ability to focus away from a particular situation and take sort of a longer view or a more reflective perspective. He says, by focusing on something in the distance, you can see more, even though everything closer is a little out of focus. And so here we can imagine the member on the facing bench who had the insight about the balcony, maybe looking up out the high arched windows of the meeting house into the sky and sort of being not connected in any particular space where he's doing something like washing the floor or delivering groceries or something to that effect, but he has this kind of reflective spatiality, and aha, it hits him. He has this insight, which then the meeting also has an aha moment, and they adopt. And it seems to me that in the meeting for business that followed shortly after the the day this insight was received, the meeting itself was very calm, but also very enthusiastic and excited about this proposal, to the point that they didn't have to wrangle anymore. They didn't have to deliberate anymore. Everything was very, very clear. It wasn't complacent, just complacent. It wasn't just agitated. It was clear, calm. They knew exactly what they wanted to do, but they were focused, so that we have both of the elements there of energy and tranquility that gives rise to this kind of deep serenity, telling them, which is the holy is telling them, that this is the way for the meeting to go, and that's exactly what they did. So that's a beautiful example, I think, given by Barry Morley, of how Gelassenheit, or the holy, which is characterized by this overall Gelassenheit experience of energized tranquility, how the holy, as something real, without being any kind of particular being, can lead people to make prudent judgments or decisions under its influence. Now, in the rest of the lecture, I want to say a few more things about the relation between Gelassenheit theology and teachings of Christian orthodoxy. Remember that one of the objections we considered against Gelassenheit theology, as well as against Streit theology, its possible alternative, is that it needs to be explained better how this connects to traditional Christian teachings like the Incarnation. Now, at the end of the last lecture, I said that there is a kind of Christological emphasis here in Gelassenheit theology, because it's not as if the holy and the human are like oil and water. It's not like that. It's that they can come together in a very symbiotic way. It's suggesting that they're almost made for each other, or that they're deeply compatible. Now, that already gestures in a Christological direction, because as we know, the central teaching of the Christian faith is that God became human in Jesus Christ. That wouldn't have been possible if divinity and humanity were completely incompatible, like oil and water, or they just didn't mix, or you couldn't put them together. So that's already beginning to move in a direction that's congenial to the Christian faith. Now, notice that in the Sandy Springs incident, there was a collective example of people making a decision to embrace a certain possible change, in that case, building the balcony with the panels from the old partition on the front of it. That decision was not just made individually. Yes, the one person had the insight, but it was the community that decided it. It was the community that decided, under the influence of Gelassenheit, to embrace that change. Now, it took them 3 years. We just saw that. We learned that from Morley's account of the episode. But we could also envisage a kind of communal example like that happening almost instantaneously. And here what I have in mind is what happened at Pentecost, when the disciples received the Holy Spirit in the form of fire, and they were galvanized to begin preaching the gospel in their own languages, the story goes, but they were preaching it in Hebraic probably, but everybody could hear it in their own language. The point, though, for our purposes is that they reached a decision that was very empowering, but they were also very focused and calm. They knew what they were doing. That happened almost instantaneously. And here we can speak about when the decision falls out like that. If it happens almost immediately with very little time, then that almost seems like a kind of inspiration. That's like an inspiration of the Holy Spirit. That's the way the Christian tradition would describe that, where the Holy is acting in this very powerful way, but very quickly. And this fits with the way that many Christians understand the efficacy of the Holy Spirit in our lives. Yes, it's not the only way in which the Holy Spirit can act, but it's a very powerful way in which it can act that sort of gestures towards its presence, because it happens so suddenly and it catches our attention. Now, we can also speak, I think, or we can imagine the following possibility, that there's a person who, not just at particular moments in his or her life, but throughout his entire life, has been acting under the guidance of the Holy, seamlessly. It's not like the Sandy Springs incident where it took them 3 years to make this decision. It's not like the case with you and me where it may take us some time. We need to meditate for some time in a situation of thoughtful openness before, while we're consulting a trackle clock and then retreating into holded spatiality in order to seek guidance from the Holy about whether to make the decision, what decision to make. It's not like that. We can imagine someone whose entire adult life, or at least from a very, very early age, has behaved like that all the time, has always been pursuing activities and behaving in such a way that he is guided by this kind of energized tranquility of Gelassenheit. And here I think we have a model not only of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, which is something that we may, or of the Holy, which is something that we may wish to grow into, but when we're talking about somebody who's been like that for the entirety of his life, or at least his adult life, that is a model of the Incarnation. That is a model of Jesus, who is the vessel of the Holy. Here is a person, a human being, who is so initiated into the Holy that he's always acted that way. He's always behaved in such a way that he's being guided by the Holy. So the point is here that this theology not only is consonant with these Christian teachings, but actually gives us a new way maybe of thinking about them. It gives us tools to begin to explore them with a new eye. That's a good thing. That's something that any contemporary theology that's going to have any chance of being successful and helpful should do. Now, that's all I want to say for today. Next time, I want to continue with this sort of Christological emphasis, but I want to apply it to a very specific issue. And that has to do, as I said last time, with Heidegger's involvement with National Socialism, particularly during the year of his rectorate at Freiburg University from 1933 to 1934. I want to see how the Holy and other aspects of Christianity that might be explicated in a certain way by Gelassenheit theology, how can that help us to better understand what's probable? Well, we know that it's wrong, but how can we safeguard ourselves against the kinds of decisions that Heidegger made during that period of his rectorate? We want to get clear about his Nazi philosophy during that time and how it relates to some philosophical developments of his later. We want to see what's problematic about all that, and we want to see better how the Holy, insofar as it's explicated by the Gelassenheit theologian, can help us to avoid those kinds of pitfalls. So that will be our task next time. In the meantime, I also again welcome your questions, and I look forward to continuing to discuss this material with you further. This is Dr. Peter Dillard signing off for Black Cat Theology. Thank you.